Okay, everybody, we are back with more a film festival radio show with me, Janice Malone here. And of course, want to always thank you guys for listening. Make sure you drop us a line, info@filmfestivalradio.com. So listen, to further speak of fascinating and interesting guests, that brings us to our guest right here. We have her on the line all the way from the beautiful islands of Hawaii. She is a very talented journalist, filmmaker, writer, producer, and director. Her name is Yaoi Winfrey, and she has a brand new documentary that just came out called War Brides of Japan. It's a documentary film about World War II Japanese war brides who married American military soldiers during the U.S. occupation of Japan. So, Yaoi, welcome to the show, and thank you for being my guest today.
Well, thank you for having me on your show, Janice. I appreciate it.
Well, now, as I said, that your film, War Brides of Japan, is actually, am I describing this correctly if I say it's like 5 film shorts or like mini films within to make one big project? Is that a good explanation or what?
Well, technically they are short films because each of them is under 1 hour. I set out to make a full-length documentary, but I over-interviewed. I didn't want to leave anybody out. Most of the interviewees are the adult children of these war brides, and it was very imperative for them to get the stories out about their mothers. Very little known part of American history, and so they were really adamant about wanting to speak about their mothers and their families. So once I put all of it together, after editing it, it was 3.5 hours long.
Oh, wow.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So then I began to sort of group them by what was common among the different interviewees, and then I came up with the 5 different subject areas that made that those films really fit under very well together.
Now we're going to get into each one of those film shorts, and you can give us a brief synopsis of which each one is about. But first, before we get to that, how did this all get started, this whole project? And you can tell the listeners about yourself and exactly how it all got started.
Okay, so my mother was a Japanese war bride, and my father was an African-American soldier from Texas. Growing up in our early years, we were always on military bases, and we were surrounded by every mixture of people. There were German war brides, French war brides. They were married to black and white soldiers. There were Puerto Ricans, there were Filipinos. We never gave a thought to race or ethnicity. It was just normal. But once we moved out of the military bases and into civilian neighborhoods, then we became an anomaly. We were not only people of color, but I had parents that were 2 different colors, separate cultures from each other, and that was just considered so weird by this dominant majority group that we lived around. So around that time, as I'm growing up, I'm thinking, well, I have this very unique situation, and then my mother was so creative and so expressive about her Japanese culture that we learned a lot. And a lot of people that met my mother thought she was very interesting. I met a filmmaker in the year 2000 while I was living in Seattle, and he said, we should make a film about your mom. She's such an interesting character. And I was like, oh, okay. And so that I had that thought to do that, and then it didn't work out with him. And then there was another filmmaker that came along 2 more times that just didn't work out. And finally in 2012, I saw an ad for a 30-second competition. You could make a little snippler, they called it, 30 seconds long, and submit it to this particular film festival in Los Angeles. So that's what I did. And I was one of 3 finalists, and I was really surprised that people were responding to this subject matter of Japanese war brides. However, I made it in some software that included a logo of that software that I could not remove, so I was later disqualified. But I still had this feeling that, wow, people would like to learn more about this part of history. They'd like to learn a little bit more. So I continued to pursue it, and then by 2016 is when I began fundraising and asking for donations in order for me to travel and interview these different people. So that's how it all began.
And when you say travel, you traveled throughout the Pacific Northwest, the western region of the country, and did you also go over to Japan or what?
Well, I went to Japan on my own before I began the film because I wanted to film areas like where I was born and just other, important places. That's actually not in the. Turns out none of that is in the film because I just didn't have any more room. But for the interviewees, yes, I did stay with the West Coast. Mostly was California. A lot of war bride families ended up in California, and that's because California was more open and more liberal to these mixed race marriages. When these American GIs were marrying these brides and trying to bring them back to the U.S., at that time there were 16 states in the United States that had anti-miscegenation laws on the books. In other words, any Caucasian person could not marry anybody else except for a Caucasian person, another one. And so they would have been married illegally if they had gone to some of these other states. But California was very open, so that's where you find a lot of war brides family, and also Washington State, because there was a big military base there, which is where our family ended up. And, it was really nice for the brides to be able to be around other brides like themselves, because a lot of times when they first came over, the husbands would be from, somewhere in the Midwest or, something like that. And that's where the bride would end up, with no other Asians around, no other Japanese, no Japanese food, books, things to read. So they were very isolated. So it was good that they ended up in these military bases, and particularly on the West Coast. It was a good thing for them.
Something I forgot to ask you your research and such. Did any of the women, did they still have their wedding dresses or their wedding gowns? Were they still available?
Well, what they wore when they got married a lot in Japan, because those marriages were not recognized by the United States. Those were Shinto marriages. So they would wear, in a Shinto ceremony, the bride wears a white kimono. It's a very long kimono usually. And then they have this headpiece that's very, very involved, very intricate. So a lot of them had those Shinto weddings in Japan, but those marriages were not recognized by the United States. These women are marrying their former enemies. The U.S. did some major bombing in Japan. Besides, just the 2 nuclear bombs, they were bombing relentlessly, B-52 bombs in Tokyo. They leveled Tokyo. That was the major city, and it was leveled. So there was a lot of feelings of hostility against these Americans then coming to occupy Japan. So on the U.S. side, it took a while for them to pass laws to allow these men to marry these women. They had to actually come in, I think, on the 1945 War Brides Act, which was really enacted for the European war brides, the ones in Germany and France, Belgium. But the occupation of Japan came a little bit later, I think. So, but those women were allowed to immigrate to the U.S. based on that 1945 War Brides Act.
Now, your film, again, War Brides of Japan, and I highly encourage everyone, especially to start off, going to see the website. The website is just so beautiful and so creative, artistic. warbridesofjapan.com is where you can go and get even more details and see all of the information and what have you. But the film has really received a lot of good recognition by international film festivals throughout the world. So tell us about some of the film festivals that have really received this film well.
Yeah, I just have a kind of a different format because it's not a full-length feature documentary, but it's chopped up 5 different films. So some of them I've been entering them in different types of competitions, because as you know, there's full-on documentary film festivals. There's festivals for women, different subject matters. So I also created a lot of posters. I created a separate poster for all 5 films. Those I've also been entering in a lot of different festivals. Most of them have been primarily in India, Russia. I can't remember all the countries, but a lot of European countries. I don't recall if we've been in anything in the U.S. yet. No, I don't think so.
Well, that's a lot of international recognition, but this is an international topic matter of a film, though, so that's understandable for foreign film festivals to reach out and embrace the whole topic. So what's been the reaction from some of the people who are in the film? What's that been like, now that they've seen the finished product?
Well, okay, so most of the people in the film are the adult children of these war brides. A lot of the war brides have passed away already because they've been in their 80s and 90s. When they came over in between the late 40s and early 50s, a lot of them were 20, 25, and sometimes a little bit older than that. So a lot of them have passed away. So these are their children who are now in their 60s, sometimes 70s, that are recalling what it was like growing up with these 2 cultures in the house. You had an American father and a Japanese mother. So I think it was very important for them to have that recognized, because now we see all these mixed race families. Well, not all, but I mean, we see a lot more than we've ever seen before. But for that generation, it was very unusual. And like I said, once you were off the military bases and you're in civilian housing somewhere, you're going to be the only one in your neighborhood with parents that don't match exactly.
Yes.
And so you're always standing out. And, there was no such thing as being mixed, back in the 50s and 60s and before that. If you were like myself with an African-American father, they had the 1-drop rule. If you had 1 drop of black blood, you were considered black, period. There was no other category for you. And yet you had this very Japanese person living in the house, raising you, serving you Japanese food, telling you the history, you do all the rituals. If they were practicing Shinto, which is the indigenous religion of Japan, or Buddhism, they would have things in the house like the Butsudan that houses the gohonzo, which is for praying, for Buddha, praying to Buddha. You're growing up with this, and then yet you're also eating ham hocks and, cornbread. And then it's like, it's so normal for you. But once anybody steps into your house and your world, they're like, well, what is going on here? This is weird. So you always felt unaccepted, And in my case, I don't know about the people that grew up in California, they probably had a lot more contact with Japanese Americans, but where we grew up, there wasn't a big, significant population of Japanese Americans. There were a few, but, so that also, you weren't always accepted by that group either, because you're mixed. We like to say hapa, which means half. It's a Hawaiian pidgin word for half, or hafu, which is how Japanese people call half people. A lot of us don't consider ourselves half and half. We say there's a filmmaker who actually says we're doubles. We have double everything that anybody else has. We have 2 cultures. We have 2 languages. So I think, so back to your original question, it was very important for that age group of people to be recognized, because they've never been recognized, because now we have YouTube and we have these, millennials and maybe people slightly older than that saying, oh, yes, I'm mixed and, aren't I cute, whatever. But they don't understand that, in this other generation, it was a struggle. It was such a struggle, never fitting in.
Yeah, and probably a lot of times of being a bit isolated, especially when their husbands were away, military duties, or just simply at work. That must have been very difficult, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, they did, some of them got to go to the American Red Cross War Bride School in Japan, which taught them English and taught them how to assimilate into this Western culture. In Japan, they sleep on the floor. You roll out the futon, you sleep on the floor. So they had to learn how to make an American bed. They're cooking Japanese food, which, it's always hot white rice and pickled vegetables and maybe fish and, some other little things. They're not going to get that in the U.S. That's not going to exist for maybe a good 10, 20 years because, like I said, there are pockets of Japanese American communities where they probably had that food. You would have to go into those communities to find that kind of thing. And, the celebrations, the rituals, like the Obon Festival, which is an annual dance festival honoring the ancestors, you would find that practiced in Japanese American communities. So those brides would have to connect with that to make that happen. So yeah, they were very isolated in certain situations. People ended up on farms somewhere. My mother had to go to Richmond, Texas, which is where my dad is from, and it was completely segregated, and there were no Asians of any type in the whole town where she went. And it was kind of a little country town. My grandmother gave her some chickens so she could, have eggs. So the chickens would produce eggs. And my mom's from Tokyo. That's like, the biggest city in the world. She's like totally a city girl. And here she goes to this little farm community and, country community, and it's very segregated. She doesn't understand segregation. My dad's relatives, she remembers getting on the bus with them, and of course, they're all black, and she gets on, and the white bus driver tells her, oh, you don't have to go in the back with them. And she's all confused because she's with them, but why is he telling her, she's not? Not speaking the language that well, not having any of the culture that you are so used to, that you grew up with, not having any of that available to you. And on top of that, you can just turn around and go home. There's no international travel by plane yet. There's no long-distance telephone call. I don't think people even had telephones in their houses.
Probably
for the
not.
First few years. Yeah.
And then not to mention, she was obviously quite young, too.
My mother was older than a lot of the war brides. She was already in her 30s, when she came over.
Okay.
But
it's still tough.
But the youngest bride in our in the interview, she was only 19 when she got married and came to the U.S. I think she did better because she was younger, so she wasn't. My mother had this full life of being Japanese and then having to switch and having to change and trying to assimilate and be American.
That's a lot. And me being originally growing up in Houston, I know exactly where Richmond, Texas is. And so, I know, now it's a little bit larger, but I can only imagine back in the 50s how small it must have been, obviously. So that was hard. But I just want to remind listeners, we are talking with journalist, independent filmmaker, producer, writer, Yaoli Winfrey. She's beautiful Hawaii. Give us a call. Talking about her latest film project, War Brides of Japan. And it's quite a fascinating topic. The whole project is just so eye-opening and quite educational, and it's entertaining as well. And there is humor in it. That's what is such a pleasant breath of fresh air. There is some humor in it. It's not all, oh wow, I'm going to be. No, it's there are many lighthearted moments, and I highly suggest people go and rent it. Now, tell everybody how they can see all 5 of these film shorts.
Okay, so they're on my Vimeo page, and that page has a section called Video on Demand. So all 5 of those short films are available for rent at Video on Demand on Vimeo. And my Vimeo page is, I believe, called Watermelon Sushi. I am going to look for that exact link. I don't know why I didn't have it. I'm sorry. Where is it? On Vimeo. Okay. It's okay. Let me find the exact.
Oh, sure. I have always liked that. watermelon sushi. I've always liked that.
That's next. That's what we're working on next. That's definitely next. Okay, so here is the link. Vimeo.com/watermelonsushi/BOD_pages.
Okay.
Vimeo.com/watermelonsushi/BOD_pages.
Okay.
And that will show you all 5 of the films that are available. You can click on them and watch the trailer, and then you can rent whichever ones you like. Hopefully you like all 5, but you can watch just one if you want.
They should. They should like all 5. As I said, the films are very informative. It teaches you about that period of American history, Japanese history, as the two intertwined there. But again, it's also quite entertaining. So I think you did a wonderful job on combining, morphing the two together. And so before we close out, so again, warbridesofjapan.com is the website. But tell us your next project. You just mentioned Watermelon Sushi. Cool title. What would that be about?
Well, Watermelon Sushi is where I started, but I realized much later I should have started with the brides, because it is a story. It's a family story about 2 sisters who are Japanese and African American, and how each one of them sort of looks different from the other, so they are identified by others, not by themselves, but by others, as being, monoracial. But to them, they're embracing the culture of the opposite ethnic group that people peg them for. Because it's kind of a tug of war, when people look at you and they just make an assumption. Mm-hmm. You must be this because, they stereotype you. And so that's what happens to these 2 sisters. And it's really sort of unconscious on a very subconscious level for them, but they begin embracing the other culture. So for instance, the older sister has a very, very Asian type features, a typical Asian look. She is completely into hip hop and rap. This film takes place in the 80s at the advent of the whole hip hop movement, and that's what she jumps into in the film Watermelon Sushi. And her sister, who has more of what you would call an African phenotype, she's just the opposite. She speaks fluent Japanese. She does all these Japanese rituals. So in the story, they're just having to confront how they shape their identity and why. And it's just a cute little family story. Has a nice ending. But the mother was sort of almost invisible. She's in the film, but I realized after I wrote the script, and I did shoot the film once, but it needs to be redone, that you have to tell, the mother's story needs to be told. So that's why the War Brides of Japan came up, because that has to be told. We need to know, what these mothers went through, what these brides went through, and then we can understand why the children are the way they are.
Absolutely. Love
yeah,
it.
There's some really, really, a very much a variety of adult children and how they turned out. One of them in the film, if you look at number, let me see, which one is it? Oh, The Brides, where I actually have 2 war brides in the film. One of them married a Caucasian man. He was in the Marines, and one married an African-American soldier. And then, they tell separate stories. One follows the other. And you will see such a contrast in how their lives went once they arrived in the U.S. One of the daughters is now a Buddhist priest. She is the only non-Japanese priest in her sect, in her particular Buddhist sect. So that was, that's a really big deal. So it's really interesting to look at these adult children and see how they incorporated both cultures. One of them has she had a Mexican-American father, so her mother learned how to make tamales, and so it's just very interesting. The whole cross-cultural thing is very interesting, yeah.
And I also think this is a wonderful way to pay homage to your mom and your family as well.
Yeah, I think, you brought up humor earlier. My mother was just the funniest person, and I think for a lot of the brides too, that humor was a defense mechanism. When you're living in a country that's bombed all the time, the air raid siren goes off, that, your nerves are shattered. You got to go run to a bomb shelter. And a lot of the women were, just teenage girls. They were a little bit older than teenagers. My mother was a little bit older. You got to run to the shelter. You're hiding in there. When you come out, you see all this devastation. You see bodies in the street. There had to be food rationing. They were short on everything. So, people were starving. It was a really tough time for them. And so I think they kind of developed this weird, wacky sense of humor. My mother was always funny, always telling stories and joking and laughing. And so I really wanted to bring that into the picture. And also because a lot of the brides did make pretty happy marriages. They were very satisfied because, at first it's really difficult. You move to another country, you barely speak the language, you don't know what are all these weird things they're doing. We never did those things, But once they started assimilating into American lifestyle, they're very proud of their children and what their children became, and they made good lives. They don't know, it's hard to say whether had they stayed in Japan it would have been better, because eventually, Japan recovered and, the economy really built up and it became very modern. So we don't know if it would have been better for them to have stayed behind or whether coming here was a good choice for them. But I can say all the brides I spoke with and the ones that are no longer here, the research I did on them, they are very proud of their children and what their children accomplished in this country, coming here. So those are some very positive takeaways with the film.
Yeah, it is. As I said, overall, it's educational, informative, but it's also quite entertaining as well. And so I just want to commend you for doing this project. I've been one of your biggest cheerleaders for it.
I know. I so appreciate you. You're just like, pushing and get it done. And, this is great. Just wonderful. You've been a good sounding board. Yeah.
Well, again, want to remind everyone the videos, I shouldn't say videos, the films is 5 film shorts. Tell them one more time where they can go and rent these films.
Okay, and I think you're right. They are considered videos because, they're online like this. They're not shot on film. We did shoot them digitally, so technically they are videos. So they are at www.vimeo.com, /Watermelon Sushi, WATERMELONSUSHI/BOD_pages, PAGES. So those are the BOD, video on demand pages, and they're on Vimeo under Watermelon Sushi.
Okay, and again, I really want people to go see the beautiful website, warbridesofjapan.com. And just wait, you'll see what I'm talking about, how beautiful this website is. So, Obi, thank you so much. You have really just given us a wealth of information here about your new film. And you're always welcome to come back when Watermelon Sushi is ready, so we can talk more about that one too, okay?
Oh, I appreciate that so much, Janice. Thank you so much for all of your support and encouragement. I just can't thank you enough. So, absolutely. As we say in Hawaii, mahalo nui loa.
Okay. Well, I'll never be able to pronounce it as well as you. But thank you so very much. So very much.
Thank you.